The misty rain cloaked Portland in a soft, gray veil, transforming the city into a watercolor painting. Droplets tapped gently against windows and slicked the streets, creating a soothing rhythm that belied the urgency about to unfold. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and fresh-cut grass, a stark contrast to the usual urban aromas. Through this atmospheric tableau, a tour bus wound its way along the tree-lined streets. Its wipers swished back and forth, clearing the windshield in a hypnotic dance. Behind the wheel sat Frank Thompson, a man whose salt and pepper hair and laugh lines spoke of years of experience navigating both roads and life itself. Frank's weathered hands gripped the steering wheel with practiced ease as he maneuvered the bus through the quiet morning traffic. His eyes, sharp despite the early hour, scanned the road ahead while occasionally glancing at his passengers in the rearview mirror. The bus interior hummed with the low murmur of conversation. A group of seniors, bundled in light jackets and raincoats, filled the seats. Some dozed, lulled by the gentle motion and patter of rain. Others chatted in hushed tones, their voices a pleasant backdrop to the journey. In the front row, Mildred Peterson, a sprightly octogenarian with a shock of white hair, leaned forward, her eyes bright with anticipation. "Frank, dear," she called out, her voice carrying a hint of mischief. "Any chance we'll see those famous roses today? Or has this drizzle drowned them all?" Frank chuckled, the sound warm and reassuring. "Don't you worry, Mildred. Those roses are tougher than they look. We'll make sure you get your fill of blooms, rain or shine." A few seats back, Harold and Edna Simmons, a couple celebrating their 60th wedding anniversary, sat hand in hand. Harold's thumb traced gentle circles on Edna's palm, a silent gesture of affection honed over decades. As the bus approached Washington Park, Frank eased off the accelerator. The vehicle slowed, coming to a stop at a designated area near the park's entrance. "All right, folks," Frank announced, his voice carrying easily through the bus. "We'll take a quick break here. Stretch those legs if you'd like. But remember, it's a bit damp out there." A few passengers stood, ready to brave the drizzle for a breath of fresh air. Frank watched as they carefully made their way down the steps, ever vigilant of their safety. He was about to follow them out when something caught his eye. Through the misty veil, a shape emerged, small, four-legged, and moving with purpose. As it drew closer, Frank realized it was a dog, a beagle of medium build, its tri-colored coat darkened by the rain. But it wasn't the dog's appearance that struck him. It was its behavior. The beagle was barking frantically, its voice cutting through the quiet morning air. It raced towards the bus, then back towards the park, then again to the bus. Its eyes, wide and pleading, seemed to lock onto Frank's. "Well, what do we have here?" Frank muttered, more to himself than anyone else. He leaned forward, peering through the windshield for a better look. The dog's barks grew more insistent, a crescendo of urgency that sent a shiver down Frank's spine. This wasn't the playful yapping of a pet seeking attention. No, this was something else entirely. Mildred, who had remained in her seat, piped up, "Frank? What's going on out there?" Frank's brow furrowed as he watched the beagle's frantic dance. "There's a dog out here, Mildred, and something's not right." By now, the passengers who had ventured outside were huddled under the bus's awning, their attention caught by the distressed animal. Murmurs of concern rippled through the group. The beagle, seeming to sense it had finally captured someone's attention, redoubled its efforts. It ran to Frank's door, pawing at it, then darted a few feet away, looking back expectantly. Frank felt a tug in his chest. In all his years of driving, he'd never encountered anything quite like this. The dog's eyes, so full of intelligence and desperation, spoke of an urgency that couldn't be ignored. With a deep breath, Frank made a decision. He stood up, addressing the passengers both inside and outside the bus. "Folks, I think something's wrong. This dog, it's trying to tell us something." A ripple of surprise and concern swept through the group. Harold, who had joined the others outside, spoke up, his voice gruff with worry. You think it needs help, Frank? Frank nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the Beagle. I do, Harold, and I think we need to find out what's going on. Edna, standing beside her husband, clutched his arm. But Frank, what about our schedule? And is it safe? Frank understood their concerns. These tours ran on tight schedules, and deviating from the plan was unusual, to say the least. But as he looked at the Beagle, still barking and pawing at the ground, he knew he couldn't just drive away. I know this isn't part of our usual tour, Frank began, his voice steady and reassuring. But I can't in good conscience ignore this. Something's wrong, and if we can help, we should. He paused, looking at each of his passengers in turn. I'm going to follow this dog and see what's happening. I won't go far, and I'll be back as quick as I can. Is everyone okay with that? There was a moment of silence, broken only by the patter of rain and the Beagle's insistent barks. Then, slowly, heads began to nod. Mildred's voice rang out, clear and strong. Go on, Frank. We'll be right here waiting. With a grateful nod, Frank stepped out of the bus. The cool, damp air hit his face as he approached the Beagle. Up close, he could see the intelligence in the dog's eyes, the desperation in its movements. All right, boy, Frank said softly, crouching down to the dog's level. What is it? What are you trying to tell me? As if understanding, the Beagle's barks quieted. It looked at Frank intently, then turned and began to trot towards the park. After a few steps, it looked back, clearly wanting Frank to follow. Frank straightened up, his decision made. He turned to his passengers, most of whom were now watching from the bus windows or huddled under the awning. I'm going to see where it leads me. I promise I won't go far, and I'll be back soon. With that, he began to follow the Beagle, his steps quickening to match the dog's urgent pace. The rain had lessened to a fine mist, but it still clung to Frank's jacket and hair as he moved deeper into the park. The Beagle led him off the main path, weaving between trees and shrubs. Frank's heart began to race, not from exertion, but from the growing sense that something truly serious was unfolding. As they moved further from the bus, the sounds of the city faded, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the soft squelch of mud under Frank's shoes. The Beagle never faltered, its path sure and determined. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, but was likely only a few minutes, the dog stopped. It turned to Frank, gave a single sharp bark, then looked ahead intently. Frank followed the dog's gaze, his eyes straining in the dim light filtered through the trees. At first, he saw nothing but undergrowth and fallen leaves. Then, a splash of color caught his eye, something that didn't belong in this natural setting. His breath caught in his throat as he realized what he was seeing. There, partially hidden by a large rhododendron bush, lay a person.
Are you enjoying this video? Share your thoughts in the comments below and don't forget to like and subscribe for more heartwarming stories.
Oh my God, Frank breathed, his feet already moving. He rushed forward, pushing aside wet branches, his heart pounding in his ears. As he drew closer, details came into focus. It was an elderly man, lying on his side. His clothes were soaked through, his white hair plastered to his forehead. But what struck Frank most was the man's face, pale, with a bluish tinge to his lips. Frank dropped to his knees beside the man, his training kicking in despite the shock of the situation. Sir, can you hear me? He called out, gently shaking the man's shoulder. The man's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and filled with pain. He tried to speak, but only a weak groan escaped his lips. Frank's mind raced. The man's color, his labored breathing. These were signs he recognized from his first aid training. Sir, I think you're having a heart attack. I'm going to get help. He fumbled for his phone, grateful he'd slipped it into his pocket before leaving the bus. As he dialed 911, the Beagle, who Frank now realized must belong to this man, whined softly and pressed close to its owner's side. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's calm voice cut through Frank's rising panic. I'm in Washington Park, Frank began, his words tumbling out. I've found an elderly man who I think is having a heart attack. We're off the main path near the Rose Garden. Please, send help quickly. As he spoke, Frank kept his free hand on the man's shoulder, both to reassure him and to monitor his condition. The man's eyes had closed again, but his chest still rose and fell with shallow breaths. Sir, help is on the way, Frank said, ending the call. Can you tell me your name? The man's eyes opened again, a flicker of awareness passing through them. Robert, he managed to whisper. Robert Davis. Okay, Robert. You're going to be all right. The ambulance is coming. Frank tried to keep his voice steady and reassuring, even as worry gnawed at him. Is this your dog? Robert's eyes moved to the Beagle, who hadn't left his side. A weak smile touched his lips. Charlie, he breathed. Good boy. Frank felt a lump form in his throat. This loyal dog, this Charlie, had potentially saved his owner's life with his persistence and intelligence. As they waited for the ambulance, Frank did what he could to make Robert comfortable. He used his own jacket to cover the man, trying to keep him warm in the damp chill. All the while, Charlie stood guard, his eyes never leaving his owner's face. The minutes stretched on, feeling like hours. Frank found himself talking, more to fill the silence than anything else. He told Robert about the tour group waiting back at the bus, about the roses they had come to see. Anything to keep Robert conscious and focused. Finally, the welcome sound of sirens pierced the air. Frank felt a wave of relief wash over him. Hear that, Robert? Help's almost here. You're going to be just fine. As the sirens grew louder, Frank realized he needed to guide the paramedics to their location, but he was reluctant to leave Robert alone. Charlie, he said, turning to the Beagle, can you go find the paramedics? Can you bring them here? As if understanding every word, Charlie's ears perked up. With a last look at his owner, the dog took off towards the sound of the sirens, barking loudly to attract attention. Frank watched in amazement as the dog disappeared into the undergrowth. Then he turned back to Robert, whose breathing had become even more labored. Hang on, Robert, Frank urged, squeezing the man's hand. Help is almost here. You've got to hang on. The sound of rustling leaves and hurried footsteps announced the arrival of the paramedics, led by the ever-vigilant Charlie. Frank had never been so glad to see anyone in his life. As the paramedics swarmed around Robert, Frank stepped back, suddenly feeling the weight of the past few minutes. He watched as they worked efficiently, attaching monitors, administering oxygen, preparing Robert for transport. One of the paramedics approached Frank. Sir, can you tell us what happened? Frank recounted the events, from Charlie's appearance at the bus to finding Robert in the park. The paramedic nodded, jotting down notes. You did good, she said, patting Frank's arm. Your quick action and that dog's intelligence, well, they may very well have saved this man's life. Frank felt a mix of emotions wash over him. Relief, exhaustion, and a profound sense of the fragility of life. He watched as Robert was carefully loaded onto a stretcher, Charlie never more than a few feet away. As they prepared to move Robert to the ambulance, his eyes opened once more. They found Frank's, and with what seemed like great effort, Robert spoke. Thank you, he whispered, his voice barely audible. And take care of Charlie, please. Frank nodded, his throat tight with emotion. Of course, Robert. You just focus on getting better. Charlie will be fine. As Robert was wheeled away, Frank found himself with a new responsibility. He looked down at Charlie, who sat at his feet, looking up with those same intelligent eyes that had first caught Frank's attention. Well, Charlie, Frank said softly, looks like you and I have a bit of an adventure ahead of us. With a deep breath, Frank realized he needed to get back to his tour group. They must be worried sick by now. But as he turned to head back to the bus, he felt a newfound spring in his step. Today hadn't gone as planned, not by a long shot. But sometimes, Frank reflected, it's the unexpected detours that remind us of what's truly important in life. With Charlie trotting faithfully by his side, Frank made his way back through the park, ready to face whatever came next. As Frank made his way back through the park, Charlie trotting faithfully by his side, the weight of the morning's events settled on his shoulders. The mist had lifted, leaving behind a world washed clean, the air crisp and filled with the scent of damp earth and fresh leaves. Frank's mind raced, replaying the scene he had just witnessed. The image of Robert Davis, pale and struggling for breath, was etched into his memory. He glanced down at Charlie, marveling at the dog's intelligence and loyalty. Without this brave Beagle, Robert's fate might have been very different. As they neared the bus, Frank could see his passengers gathered outside, their faces etched with concern and curiosity. Mildred was the first to spot them, her eyes widening as she took in the sight of Frank returning with a dog at his heels. "Oh my stars," Mildred exclaimed, her voice carrying to the others. "Frank's back, and he's brought company." The group surged forward, a flurry of questions filling the air. Frank held up his hands, trying to quiet the commotion. Folks, please, give me a moment to explain." As the chatter died down, Frank took a deep breath. He looked at each face in turn, seeing the mix of worry and anticipation in their eyes. "I've got quite a story to tell you," he began, his voice steady despite the lingering adrenaline in his system. Frank recounted the events of the past hour, from Charlie's frantic appearance to the discovery of Robert and the arrival of the paramedics. As he spoke, he could see the emotions play across his passengers' faces. Shock, concern, and finally, awe. "So you see," Frank concluded, "this little fella here is a real hero." He reached down to pat Charlie's head, and the Beagle leaned into his touch, tail wagging slowly. There was a moment of stunned silence. Then Harold spoke up, his gruff voice thick with emotion. "Well, I'll be. That's some dog you've got there, Frank." Edna, still clutching her husband's arm, wiped a tear from her cheek. "Oh, that poor Mr. Davis. I do hope he'll be all right. And what about Charlie here? What's to become of him?" Frank looked down at Charlie, who gazed back with those soulful eyes that had first caught his attention. "Well, Robert asked me to take care of him until he's back on his feet. So it looks like we've got ourselves a temporary tour mascot." A ripple of excited murmurs ran through the group. Mildred clapped her hands in delight. "Oh, how wonderful! A dog on our tour bus. Now that's something you don't see every day." Frank couldn't help but smile at the enthusiasm. Despite the gravity of the situation they'd just faced, there was something heartening about the way his passengers had rallied around Charlie. "All right, folks," Frank said, gesturing towards the bus. "I know this has been quite an exciting morning, but we've still got a tour to finish. What do you say we get back on the road?" As the passengers filed back onto the bus, Frank knelt down beside Charlie. "You ready for a little adventure, buddy?" he asked softly. Charlie's tail wagged in response, and Frank could have sworn he saw a glimmer of excitement in those brown eyes. With Charlie settled comfortably in the front seat next to him, Frank started the engine. As they pulled away from the curb, he couldn't help but marvel at the strange turns life could take. This morning he'd been just another tour bus driver. Now he was the caretaker of a canine hero. The rest of the tour took on a different flavor with Charlie on board. At each stop, passengers would take turns petting him and praising his bravery. The Beagle soaked up the attention, his tail wagging constantly. But Frank noticed how Charlie's eyes would often turn to the window, as if searching for his owner. As they drove through the city, Frank found himself sharing stories about service dogs and animal heroes he'd heard about over the years. The passengers listened with rapt attention, many sharing their own tales of remarkable pets. "You know," Harold mused during one such conversation, "I never really understood why people got so attached to their pets. But after today, well, I think I'm starting to get it." Edna squeezed her husband's hand, a knowing smile on her face. Maybe we should think about getting a dog when we get home, dear." As the day wore on, Frank noticed a change in the group dynamic. The shared experience of the morning had brought them closer together. Conversations flowed more freely, laughter came more easily. Even those who had been quiet at the start of the tour were now joining in, sharing their thoughts and feelings about the day's events. As they approached their final stop, the International Rose Test Garden, Frank made an announcement. "Folks, I know this has been an unusual tour, to say the least, but I hope you'll indulge me in one last detour." Curious murmurs filled the bus as Frank navigated to a nearby animal shelter. "I thought we might make a little donation in honor of our hero, Charlie here. What do you think?" The response was overwhelmingly positive. As Frank parked the bus, he was touched to see his passengers already reaching for their wallets and purses. Inside the shelter, the staff were moved by the story of Charlie's bravery. As Frank's group made their donations, many of the passengers took the time to visit with the shelter animals, their hearts opened by the day's events. Mildred, who had been one of Charlie's most ardent admirers throughout the day, approached Frank as they were preparing to leave. "You know, Frank," she said, her eyes twinkling, "I think I might just adopt one of these little darlings. After all, if Charlie here can be such a hero, who knows what other amazing animals are out there waiting for a home?" Frank felt a lump form in his throat. In all his years of driving tours, he'd never experienced a day quite like this one. As they boarded the bus for the last time, he could see that something had changed in his passengers. There was a warmth, a sense of connection that hadn't been there at the start of the day. As they pulled up to the hotel where the tour would end, Frank stood to address the group one last time. "Folks, I want to thank you for your patience and understanding today. I know this wasn't the tour you signed up for, but I hope it's been a memorable one nonetheless." A chorus of agreement filled the bus. Harold spoke up, his voice gruff with emotion. "Frank, I think I speak for all of us when I say this has been the best darn tour we've ever been on, and it's all thanks to you and this little hero here." He gestured to Charlie, who was curled up contentedly in the front seat. As the passengers disembarked, each one took a moment to pat Charlie and shake Frank's hand. There were more than a few misty eyes as they said their goodbyes. Finally, the bus was empty, save for Frank and Charlie. Frank sat back in his seat, letting out a long breath. He looked down at Charlie, who gazed back with those soulful eyes. "Well, buddy," he said softly, "looks like it's just you and me now." Just then, Frank's phone buzzed. It was a message from the hospital. Robert Davis was out of surgery and doing well. He'd be able to receive visitors the next day. Relief washed over Frank. He showed the message to Charlie, and the dog's tail began to wag furiously. "What do you say we go visit your dad tomorrow, huh?" Frank asked, scratching behind Charlie's ears. As Frank started the bus to head back to the depot, he found himself reflecting on the day's events. He'd always believed that every tour told a story, but he never imagined he'd be part of one quite like this. The sun was setting as Frank parked the bus at the depot. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, a beautiful end to an extraordinary day. As he gathered his things and prepared to head home, with Charlie by his side, Frank couldn't help but feel that this was more than just the end of a tour. It was the beginning of something new. He looked down at Charlie, who was watching him expectantly. "Come on, buddy," he said warmly. "Let's go home." As they walked away from the bus, the last rays of sunlight catching Charlie's fur, Frank knew that tomorrow would bring new adventures. There would be a hospital visit, decisions to be made about Charlie's care, and no doubt a lot of paperwork to fill out about today's unscheduled detour. But for now, as he and Charlie made their way down the street, Frank was content. He'd started the day as just another tour bus driver, and he was ending it as the caretaker of a canine hero. Life, he mused, had a funny way of taking you to unexpected destinations. As they turned the corner, Frank glanced back at the bus one last time. In his mind's eye, he could still see Charlie, frantically trying to get his attention. He could see Robert, pale and struggling, in the park. He could see the faces of his passengers, transformed by the day's events. Frank smiled to himself. It had been an extraordinary day, filled with fear and hope, danger and rescue. But more than anything, it had been a day that reminded him of the incredible bonds between humans and animals, and the unexpected ways that heroes can appear in our lives. The city settled into the quiet of evening, but the ripples of Charlie's heroism would continue to spread, touching lives in ways that no one could have predicted when the day began. And somewhere in a hospital room across town, Robert Davis was recovering, unaware of the lives that had been touched and changed because of his faithful companion's determination to find help. As for Frank and Charlie, they walked on into the night, an unlikely pair brought together by extraordinary circumstances. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, they were content in each other's company, two heroes savoring the end of a remarkable day. The story of the brave Beagle and the compassionate bus driver would live on, a testament to the unexpected adventures that can unfold when we open our hearts to the silent pleas of those around us, be they human or animal. And as the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Portland settled into the night, forever changed by the events of one rainy morning and the heroism of one determined dog.